At 6:41 on the morning of 11th February 1944, on the eastern edge of the village of Voronovitsia in central Ukraine, a single M4A2 Sherman lay half-submerged in a frozen drainage ditch, its engine dead, its turret locked at 12 degrees left, while German mortar rounds began to walk closer through the fog. Ice hung from the exhaust grills like teeth. Inside the hull, 5 men waited in silence, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant crack of small arms fire. The assistant driver had his gloves off despite the cold, fingers numb and bleeding, pressed against a fuel line wrapped in cloth and wire. Outside, Panzergrenadiers were already probing the tree line less than 400 meters away. In 20 minutes, a Stu-G would move into position on the road. The report would not explain why the crew survived, or why a field repair that violated every instruction manual in the Red Army's possession worked at all. How did a mocked, improvised patch pull a Sherman out of a death trap that should have ended 5 lives before sunrise? By early 1944, the Eastern Front no longer moved like a single unbroken wave. After the destruction of German forces at Kursk and the grinding advance through left bank Ukraine, the Red Army was pressing westward in overlapping thrusts, guided by the principles of deep battle but constrained by terrain, weather, and exhaustion. In the sector south of Vinnytsia, elements of the 1st Guards Tank Army were advancing in support of infantry formations tasked with clearing a chain of villages along frozen tributaries of the Southern Bug. The front line shifted daily, sometimes hourly, not by kilometers, but by fields, tree lines, and crossroads. Orders issued at midnight were often obsolete by dawn. February brought no mercy. The brief thaws of January had given way to a renewed cold snap. Night temperatures fell below -20 degrees Celsius, while daytime highs hovered just below freezing. Snow hardened into crusted sheets over churned earth. Beneath that crust, mud waited, thick and adhesive, the legacy of the Rasputitsa that had not fully drained before the freeze returned. Vehicles that broke through the surface layer could be trapped to the belly in seconds. Engines suffered. Lubricants thickened. Rubber became brittle. Metal contracted until tolerances vanished. Lend-Lease M4A2 Shermans, delivered with diesel engines favored by Soviet crews for their lower fire risk, were respected machines but not immune to the climate. American manuals assumed maintenance facilities, proper antifreeze mixtures, and consistent fuel quality. On the Eastern Front, crews worked with what they had, captured German lubricants, diluted fuels, improvised heaters made from burning rags and shell casings. Fuel pumps froze. Oil congealed in lines never designed for prolonged exposure to such cold. Starter motors strained until windings burned. Fan belts cracked without warning. Track pins seized when mud refroze overnight. German forces opposing the advance were no longer conducting large-scale armored offensives in this region. Instead, they relied on elastic defense, delaying actions by Panzergrenadier battalions, pack guns dug in along likely approaches, and mobile reserves of assault guns waiting for overextended Soviet armor. A single immobilized tank was not an accident. It was an opportunity. German doctrine emphasized isolating such vehicles, suppressing infantry support, and destroying armor at close range where thinner side plating could be exploited. In the days leading up to 11th February, reconnaissance reports noted increased German activity along secondary roads. Civilians had fled, leaving villages empty except for livestock and abandoned equipment. Tree lines showed signs of recent digging. Soviet tank crews learned to read the ground as carefully as maps. A straight road through a village invited fire. A shallow ditch could become a grave. The Sherman that would later appear as a footnote in regimental logs had been advancing since before dawn, assigned to a small detachment supporting riflemen clearing the outskirts of Voronovitsia. The tank's role was routine. Provide direct fire against suspected strongpoints, intimidate defenders into withdrawal, and be ready to counter any sudden armored appearance. There was nothing heroic in the order. There rarely was. As the column moved off the road to bypass a collapsed bridge, the ground gave way beneath the Sherman's right track. The crust shattered, and the vehicle slid sideways into a drainage ditch half filled with frozen slush. The driver compensated, but the engine faltered. Diesel thickened by cold failed to feed cleanly. The fuel pump strained once, twice, and then stopped. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Attempts to restart the engine only worsened the problem. The starter motor drew current sluggishly. Oil pressure failed to rise. Each failed attempt drained batteries already weakened by the cold. The crew knew the rules. A tank without power was not a bunker. It was a coffin. Infantry support had moved ahead, unaware of the delay. Radio contact was intermittent, static drowning out calls for assistance. Outside, the fog thinned enough to reveal movement in the distance. Shapes between trees. A flash of reflected light that might have been a periscope, or might have been nothing at all. Time compressed. Every sound became significant. The tank commander weighed options that all led to the same conclusion. If the engine did not start, they would be found. It was in this narrowing window, with cold seeping through steel and the enemy adjusting their positions, that the assistant driver began to consider a solution that would earn laughter, anger, and disbelief in equal measure. He had seen fuel lines split in summer heat and patched them with wire and cloth. He had warmed oil pans with burning straw. But this was different. This involved cutting into the fuel system under pressure, violating orders, and risking fire inside the hull. It was a fix born not of manuals, but of desperation. At 6:41, as the first mortar round landed less than 100 meters away, the decision was no longer theoretical. The Sherman lay exposed, immobilized, and visible. The enemy was closing in, and the only thing standing between the crew and destruction was a fuel line patch no one else believed could work. The front line situation in that sector had deteriorated quietly over the previous 48 hours. What appeared on maps as a stable axis of advance was, in reality, a series of narrow corridors carved through forests and frozen fields, each vulnerable to collapse if even one vehicle stalled. The 1st Guards Tank Army was operating under orders to maintain pressure, to deny the enemy time to reorganize after recent withdrawals. Speed mattered more than cohesion. Tanks advanced in small packets, often outrunning their infantry screens, trusting that shock and momentum would compensate for thin protection. It was doctrine adapted to circumstance, not preference. German resistance reflected that same adaptation. Panzergrenadier companies were no longer holding villages to the last man. Instead, they withdrew just far enough to draw Soviet armor into exposed approaches. Pak-40 anti-tank guns were positioned to cover road bends and open fields. Mortar sections moved constantly, firing brief concentrations before relocating. 5-centimeter guns waited behind terrain folds until a target presented itself. They did not need many shells. One hit to the side or rear of a stationary tank was sufficient. Weather shaped every decision. Snow muted sound, but it also limited visibility to a few hundred meters. Engines needed to be kept running whenever possible, yet fuel shortages and maintenance realities made that impossible. Crews shut down to conserve diesel, gambling that they could restart when needed. Often they won that gamble. Sometimes they did not. On the morning of 11 February, the odds were not favorable. The Sherman's immobilization occurred less than 2 kilometers from a known German fallback line. Intelligence suggested that enemy armor had been pulled back, but intelligence on the Eastern Front was always provisional. The tank's commander understood that remaining in the ditch invited discovery. He also understood that towing was impossible under current conditions. Recovery vehicles were kilometers behind, struggling through the same ground. Infantry could not reach them in time without exposing themselves. The crew was alone. Inside the hull, the assistant driver finally spoke. His name was Senior Sergeant Ivan Fyodorovich Kolesnik. He was 27 years old, though the lines on his face suggested more. Born in a small village near Dnipropetrovsk, he had worked as a machinist before the war, maintaining agricultural engines that ran on poor fuel and worse oil. He had been mobilized in 1941, survived encirclement, and learned his trade in combat rather than classrooms. He knew the sound of an engine about to fail. He knew the smell of overheated wiring. And he knew that the fuel pump, silent beneath his hand, was the root of their paralysis. Kolesnik's rank placed him low in the hierarchy of the tank. He was not responsible for tactical decisions. He was responsible for keeping the machine alive. In training, he had been warned never to open fuel lines in combat conditions. Diesel mist could ignite. Vapors could suffocate. A spark from damaged wiring could turn the fighting compartment into an oven. Manuals were clear. So were the consequences for disobedience. Yet manuals did not account for -20 degrees, congealed fuel, and a frozen pump that could not be warmed from the outside without exposing the crew. Kolesnik had seen pumps thawed with heated oil poured over casings, but there was no oil to spare. He had seen lines bypassed temporarily to feed injectors directly, but only in workshops, never under fire. The idea forming in his mind was crude, dangerous, and dependent on timing measured in seconds. He explained it quietly, almost apologetically. The commander listened, then shook his head. The gunner muttered that it was madness. The driver stared forward, hands on controls that no longer responded. The radio operator said nothing, but his knuckles were white around his headset. They all understood the implication. If Kolesnik was wrong, they would not have time to regret it. Outside, German mortar fire adjusted. Snow leapt into the air closer now, fragments rattling against the hull. The sound of engines reached them through the fog, low and deliberate. Not trucks. Something heavier. The tank commander checked his watch. He had minutes, not hours. Kolesnik insisted once more, this time without raising his voice. He pointed to the fuel line, to the pump housing, to the cloth and wire already wrapped around a hairline crack he had noticed days earlier. The crack had been insignificant then. Now it was a weakness he intended to exploit. His plan involved relieving pressure, introducing heat from within the engine compartment using a controlled flame, and forcing diesel through the line before it could refreeze. It would mean opening a line inside the hull. It would mean trusting that the diesel would not atomize. It would mean relying on instinct rather than procedure. The commander hesitated, then nodded once. There was no order recorded, no formal authorization. In the chaos of combat, such moments were rarely documented. They existed only in memory and consequence. Kolesnik worked quickly. Gloves off again, fingers numb. He loosened the fitting with a wrench that slipped twice before catching. The smell of diesel filled the compartment, sharp and heavy. The driver held a fire extinguisher ready, its pin already pulled. The radio operator killed non-essential power to reduce the risk of sparks. The gunner kept his eye to the sight, watching the fog for movement, calling out distances that might already be obsolete. As Kolesnik struck a match shielded by his body, the tank shuddered from a nearby impact. Snow and dirt rained down. The flame flickered but held. He moved it carefully along the line, warming metal just enough to coax flow without boiling. Seconds stretched. The commander counted silently. Too long, and they would be discovered. Too short, and the pump would remain frozen. Outside, boots crunched in snow. Voices carried faintly, German, disciplined and close. A shadow passed across the periscope. The Sherman remained silent, helpless, a prize waiting to be claimed. Kolesnik tightened the fitting, wiped his hands on his trousers, and nodded. The commander gave the signal to start. The driver engaged the starter. The motor groaned, once, twice. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, deep within the engine, there was a cough, a shudder. Oil pressure began to rise, sluggish but present. Diesel reached the cylinders. The engine caught, uneven at first, then steadier. The sound was unmistakable. It echoed through the fog like a declaration. Outside, German voices stopped. Somewhere beyond the ditch, a command was shouted. Metal clanged. The window of vulnerability slammed shut as abruptly as it had opened. The Sherman was alive again, but whether it would escape the ditch, and at what cost, was still uncertain. The engine's return to life did not mean salvation. It meant attention. Diesel exhaust vented into the cold air in a thick, pale plume that cut through the fog like a signal flare. The commander knew that any German within a kilometer would now be certain of their position. Starting the engine had traded one form of death for another, and the margin for error narrowed again. At 6:46, with the engine idling unevenly, the driver attempted to engage first gear. The Sherman lurched forward less than a meter before the right track spun uselessly against frozen mud. The crust beneath the track collapsed further, the vehicle settling deeper into the ditch. The track guide horns groaned under strain. Somewhere beneath the hull, packed mud refroze instantly against exposed metal. The tank was running, but it was still trapped. The commander ordered a reduction in engine speed. Over-revving a cold engine risked snapping the fan belt or scoring the cylinders, either of which would end their chances permanently. Kolesnik listened intently, head pressed close to the engine bulkhead, attuned to every vibration. He could hear the fuel pump struggling to maintain pressure, the rhythm uneven but holding. The patch was working, for now. Outside, movement increased. Through the gunner's sight, shapes resolved into men advancing in short bounds, rifles low, keeping to folds in the ground. Panzergrenadiers, cautious but confident. They had likely assumed the tank was dead. Now they would shift tactics. A stationary Sherman could be approached from blind angles, its limited field of fire exploited. Grenades could be placed on engine decks. Hollow charges could be attached to armor seams. This was not a duel. It was an execution, unless the tank moved. At 6:48, the radio crackled to life briefly. A fragment of a transmission came through, broken by static, confirming German activity along the road. There would be no immediate help. The crew was expected to resolve the situation or be written off. Such was the unspoken reality of armored warfare at this stage of the campaign. Kolesnik made another assessment. The track was jammed not by damage, but by a combination of frozen mud and ice locking the lower run against the idler wheel. Clearing it manually would require exiting the tank, an act bordering on suicide with enemy infantry within a few hundred meters. Yet without clearing it, the tank would not climb out of the ditch. The engine alone could not overcome physics. The commander asked for options. Kolesnik did not answer immediately. He was calculating. The Sherman's diesel engine produced sufficient torque at low revolutions, but only if traction could be restored. He recalled a technique used in autumn mud, rocking the vehicle gently, alternating forward and reverse to break suction. In freezing conditions, the risk was snapping a track pin or throwing the track entirely. A thrown track here would be fatal, but remaining stationary was no longer viable. At 6:50, mortar fire resumed, closer than before. One round detonated behind the tank, showering the rear deck with fragments. The armor held, but the message was clear. The Germans were adjusting, probing, tightening the net. The commander authorized the attempt. The driver engaged reverse gently, then forward, careful not to shock the drivetrain. The engine labored, exhaust deepening in tone. The tank rocked slightly, imperceptibly at first, then with more conviction. The right track shifted a few centimeters. Mud cracked audibly as ice fractured. The left track, on firmer ground, held. German small arms fire began to snap against the hull, sharp metallic impacts that reverberated inside the fighting compartment. The gunner traversed the turret slowly, firing short bursts from the coaxial machine gun into the fog, not to hit but to discourage approach. Ammunition was conserved. Every round counted. At 6:53, the rocking motion yielded a small victory. The right track freed itself enough to rotate. The tank surged forward half a meter, then stopped again. The ditch still held it, but the angle had changed. Kolesnik felt the vibration through the hull and knew they were close to the limit. Push harder and something would break. Push less, and nothing would change. Through the periscope, the commander spotted a darker shape moving parallel to the road. Low, angular, deliberate. A Studge E3, advancing cautiously, its crew aware that a single well-placed shot would end the engagement. The assault gun stopped behind a rise, its gun likely already aligned. The clock accelerated. At 6:55, Kolesnik made a second unorthodox suggestion. He proposed briefly over-revving the engine to generate heat and vibration, risking damage but potentially loosening the remaining ice. The commander hesitated. Over-revving a cold diesel could shear components, but the alternative was annihilation. He gave a curt nod. The driver increased throttle. The engine roared, louder than before, the sound echoing across the frozen fields. Inside the hull, the noise was deafening. Kolesnik watched the oil pressure gauge, willing it not to drop. The fan belt screamed in protest but held. The fuel line patch leaked slightly, a sheen of diesel visible, but not enough to ignite. The tank lurched violently. Ice shattered beneath the track. With a grinding noise that set teeth on edge, the Sherman climbed forward out of the ditch, its nose rising then leveling. For a fraction of a second, it was exposed broadside to the unseen Studge E. The gunner fired instinctively, a high explosive round detonating against a tree line, buying moments rather than damage. At 6:57, the tank was moving under its own power, tracks biting into firmer ground. The commander ordered immediate displacement. The driver complied, steering toward a low ridge that offered partial cover. Behind them, a flash marked the Stooges' shot, the shell passing just behind the Sherman, detonating in the ditch they had vacated seconds earlier. The escape was not clean. The engine sputtered once as fuel pressure fluctuated. Kolesnik tightened the patch with trembling hands, fingers barely responsive. The tank reached the ridge and halted briefly, hull down, as the crew reassessed. German infantry fire slackened, replaced by shouted orders and hurried movement. The opportunity had slipped away. At 7:02, with the immediate threat reduced, the commander ordered withdrawal to a secondary position to rendezvous with friendly infantry. The Sherman moved slowly, cautiously, every sound scrutinized for signs of renewed failure. The fuel pump held. The engine temperature stabilized, low but acceptable. Against expectation, the patch endured. The tank would survive the morning. But the engagement was not over, and the consequences of Kolesnik's decision would echo beyond this frozen ditch, into reports, rumors, and the quiet calculus of men who learned what could be risked when nothing else remained. The withdrawal was conducted under constant threat, not of pursuit alone, but of mechanical betrayal. Every meter the Sherman covered was a test of the fragile equilibrium Kolesnik had forced into existence. The patched fuel line remained warm only because diesel continued to flow through it. A prolonged halt would allow the cold to reclaim it. The commander understood this, and ordered movement kept slow but continuous, even when terrain invited a pause. Stopping meant freezing. Freezing meant death. At 7:11, the tank reached a shallow depression where remnants of a rifle platoon were reorganizing after an aborted advance. The infantry waved them in, relief visible even through layers of frost and grime. A Sherman, even a wounded one, changed the geometry of fear. German small arms fire dwindled as the enemy reassessed. The SUG did not pursue. German doctrine discouraged reckless chase without infantry support, especially when Soviet tanks might be drawing them into a trap of their own. The commander used the brief respite to conduct a rapid internal inspection. The engine compartment smelled strongly of diesel. The fuel line patch had begun to weep more visibly, droplets collecting along the cloth wrapping. Kolesnik wiped it down, tightening wire until his fingers burned with pain. He knew the fix was temporary. At best, it might last hours. At worst, minutes. There would be no spare parts here, no proper repair until they reached a rear maintenance area, if they reached one at all. Radio contact improved slightly as atmospheric conditions shifted. Orders came through, fragmented but clear enough. Hold position until infantry secured the village outskirts, then advance cautiously toward the next tree line. The Sherman was to remain operational if possible. If not, it was to be disabled to prevent capture. The words were routine, spoken without emotion. Kolesnik felt their weight settle on him personally. By mid-morning, the weather shifted again. The fog lifted, replaced by a brittle clarity that exposed everything. Snow glittered painfully in the light. Visibility extended to over a kilometer. This favored German gunners. The commander repositioned the tank behind a ruined farmhouse, using rubble to mask its outline. The engine was kept at idle, the minimum necessary to maintain heat and fuel flow. German artillery began harassing fire shortly after 8 o'clock. Rounds fell sporadically, designed less to destroy than to unsettle. Each near miss sent vibrations through the hull that threatened to loosen the patch. Kolesnik monitored it obsessively, adjusting tension, repositioning cloth, improvising insulation with strips torn from a discarded greatcoat. He worked silently, jaw clenched, aware that every second spent on the engine was a second not spent watching for the enemy. At 8:37, a forward observer reported movement along a hedgerow to the north. Panzergrenadiers again probing, supported by machine gun fire from a concealed position. The Sherman responded with controlled bursts, high explosive rounds detonating among trees, forcing the infantry to ground. Ammunition expenditure was carefully logged. There would be no resupply until evening, if then. The tank fired 6 rounds in total before the engine note changed subtly, a barely perceptible drop in rhythm. Kolesnik froze, listening. The fuel pump hesitated, pressure wavering. He signaled the commander immediately. Another prolonged engagement risked total failure. The commander faced an impossible balance: provide support and risk immobilization, or withdraw and leave infantry exposed. At 8:52, the decision was made for them. A German pack gun opened fire from beyond the hedgerow, its first round striking the ground short, the second ricocheting off rubble less than 20 meters from the tank. The signature crack of the shot left no doubt about the threat. A stationary Sherman, even partially hull down, was vulnerable. The commander ordered immediate displacement, coordinating with infantry to fall back under cover. The Sherman moved again, slower now, engines struggling to maintain consistent output. The patch leaked more heavily, diesel odor thickening. Kolesnik knew the cloth was nearing saturation. If it failed catastrophically, fuel would spray under pressure. A single spark would be enough. At 9:06, as the tank crested a slight rise, the fuel pump faltered. The engine coughed. Oil pressure dipped alarmingly. The driver instinctively eased off throttle. The tank slowed to a crawl. Behind them, infantry shouted warnings. German fire intensified, sensing weakness. Kolesnik acted without waiting for permission. He reached into the engine compartment, ignoring the heat, and adjusted the patch again, this time adding a metal clamp scavenged from an unrelated fitting. It was crude, uneven, but it held. He shouted to the driver to maintain revolutions. The engine responded, reluctantly but enough. They cleared the rise at 9:11, reaching a defilated position near a frozen stream. The commander ordered a halt. This time, stopping was unavoidable. Infantry needed time to reorganize. Ammunition had to be redistributed. The Sherman idled, every vibration a reminder of fragility. It was during this enforced pause that Kolesnik's fix drew attention. Another tank from the battalion, having skirted the engagement, pulled alongside briefly. Its mechanic noticed the improvised patch through an open access panel and laughed, incredulous. He called it madness, a violation of everything taught. Kolesnik did not respond. He did not need approval. The tank was still running. By late morning, German pressure eased. The local engagement had failed to achieve decisive results for either side. Orders came to withdraw to a more secure assembly area for maintenance and regrouping. The Sherman joined the movement, covering approximately 6 kilometers over the next 2 hours, never stopping for more than a few minutes at a time. The patch survived every kilometer, defying expectation. At 12:34, the tank reached a temporary maintenance point established in a grove sheltered from observation. Here, proper repairs could finally be attempted. When the engine was shut down deliberately for the first time since dawn, silence fell heavy. The crew waited, half expecting the machine to refuse to cooperate again. It did not matter now. They had made it. Mechanics from the maintenance detachment examined the fuel line in disbelief. The patch was crude, dangerous, and effective. They replaced the damaged section properly, thawed the pump, and serviced the engine according to regulation. No report was filed praising ingenuity. No reprimand was issued either. The incident was recorded as a routine mechanical failure resolved in the field. But among those who saw it, the story did not end there. Word spread quietly through the battalion. A fuel line patch that worked in -20 degrees. A Sherman pulled from a ditch under fire. Laughter accompanied the retelling, but it was nervous laughter, edged with respect. Men remembered it the next time an engine faltered and manuals offered no answers. The war moved on, indifferent. Villages changed hands, front lines shifted west. But for those present, the memory of that morning remained vivid, a reminder that survival often hinged not on orders or doctrine, but on the willingness of one man to risk everything on a fix that should never have worked. The official record of the engagement ended there, folded into daily summaries that reduced hours of tension to a handful of lines. Yet the consequences of that morning did not dissipate as quickly. For the crew of the Sherman, and for those who heard the story secondhand, the incident altered how machines were understood. Not as static tools bound by manuals, but as systems that could be coerced, persuaded, and sometimes defied when necessity outweighed regulation. In the days that followed, the 1st Guards Tank Army resumed its advance westward, encountering the same pattern of resistance repeated across frozen ground. German forces withdrew methodically, trading space for time. Each village required clearing. Each road junction invited ambush. The Shermans, despite their reliability compared to older Soviet designs, continued to suffer in the cold. Fuel pumps froze. Electrical systems failed without warning. Crews adapted quietly, borrowing from experience rather than instruction. Kolesnik did not speak of his repair unless asked. He returned to routine duties, checking filters, tensioning belts, listening to the engine with the practiced ear of a man who knew its weaknesses. The patched fuel line became a point of reference rather than a template. No formal directive endorsed such a fix. It was too dangerous, too situational. But the knowledge existed now, carried informally, ready to be recalled when circumstances aligned. On 16th February, during another push toward a river crossing, a different Sherman from the same battalion suffered a near-identical failure. The temperature dropped abruptly overnight. Fuel thickened. The engine stalled in an exposed position. This time, the mechanic did not wait for orders. He attempted a variation of Kolesnik's method with less care and less luck. The fuel ignited briefly, scorching insulation and forcing the crew to abandon the vehicle. The tank was later destroyed by German fire. The lesson was clear. Improvisation demanded skill as much as courage. Without understanding, it was as lethal as the enemy. German records from this period, fragmentary and incomplete, noted increasing difficulty in predicting Soviet armored behavior. Reports mentioned tanks that should have been immobilized continuing to operate, frustrating planned ambushes. Such observations were not attributed to specific repairs or techniques. They were filed under the growing category of uncertainty that plagued German command as the front contracted. For Kolesnik's crew, the psychological impact was lasting. The commander, once skeptical, deferred more readily to his mechanic's judgment. The driver trusted the engine less as an abstract system and more as a living thing that required constant negotiation. The gunner, who had watched German infantry approach a silent hull, carried that memory into every subsequent engagement. Silence became the enemy. By early March, the weather shifted again. Thaws returned, turning frozen ground into sucking mud. The challenges changed but did not diminish. Tracks jammed. Final drives strained. Engines overheated when mud clogged cooling systems. The same improvisational mindset applied, though the specific solutions differed. Field engineering became an unspoken art, practiced in the margins between orders and survival. The Sherman itself continued to serve until April, accumulating scars that told its own history. The crew marked no victories on its hull. Such practices were discouraged. Its record existed only in maintenance logs and the memories of those inside. When it was finally withdrawn for major overhaul, Kolesnik watched it go without ceremony. Machines, like men, were temporary. After the war, interviews conducted with veterans of the 1st Guards Tank Army rarely mentioned specific incidents like the one at Voronovitsia. Memory favored larger operations, named offensives, decisive moments. Yet occasionally, in quieter conversations, mechanics spoke of winter mornings when rules failed and only judgment remained. They spoke of fuel lines warmed by flame, of engines coaxed back to life under fire. They did not always agree on details. Names blurred, dates shifted, but the essence remained. Historians examining the period have debated the extent to which such improvisations influenced operational outcomes. On a strategic level, they did not alter the course of the war. On a human level, they determined who lived to see the next day. The distinction mattered to those involved, even if it did not register in archives. The story of the fuel line patch was never formally recorded. No commendation was issued. No reprimand followed. It existed in the gray space between doctrine and reality, passed on through experience rather than text. For Kolesnik, that was enough. He returned to civilian life after the war, carrying with him a deep respect for machines and an understanding of their limits. Whether the innovation spread widely or remained an isolated act is impossible to determine with certainty. What can be said is that on one frozen morning in February 1944, a Sherman that should have been lost was not. 5 men walked away, and somewhere in the shifting calculus of the Eastern Front, that small defiance of expectation made the difference between a line item in a report and a story still told, quietly, long after the guns fell silent.